Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Emma, who, if you don't know her,
Hello.
is a regular on this little corner in some of the live streams. We met at the Chino conference, which was wonderful. We were both on the campground, both staying at the campground, and as things go when you're in person, we were able to get to know each other a little bit and realize we had a lot of overlapping interests. So I'm going to also make my plug for doing some of these in-person things. If you're interested in this, particularly, come to Arkansas in November, and we'll talk about some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about here today.
Yeah.
So Emma brought up that she was really she asked me if I'd read On Fairy Stories by an essay by Tolkien, and I said that I had read it a few times, and she said that she wanted to talk about it, and I was more than excited to, partially just because I hadn't actually read this in years, and I talk about it a lot. So thank you for getting it back in front of my face.
It's a good thing to come back to every so often.
Yeah, there's so much here. There's two or three probably main points that I remember. I think the first time I read it was in college. It was probably about 10 years ago was the first time I read it. And there's two or three things, major points that stuck with me, but goodness, I was trying to take some notes thinking, I'll find three or four things that will be interesting to talk about Emma with. And ended up, halfway through, I already had, I don't know, 20 different things that I looked at and thought, yeah, that could be an hour's conversation. So.
Well, sounds like this is going to be good then.
Yeah. But because you brought it up, Emma, I'm going to let you start out with whatever it is that struck your interest or anything that you really wanted to bring up. And
all right, do we want to do like a really quick overview summary, just in case people come across this video that haven't actually read it before?
That sounds great. Yeah.
All right. So I kind of
hear what your summary is.
I kind of think of it as happening in like three parts. The first part, Tolkien's such an academic in this. It's so funny.
Mm-hmm.
The first part, I think, is sort of like just summarizing what he means by fairy stories and what other people mean by fairy stories, and some of his gripes with people who study fairy tales and the way they use them. Because he gets very upset about people who use fairy tales just as data points for language and don't appreciate them as stories in themselves.
Yes. And to be clear, he means just, right? Because he says it's not a bad thing to do, but when you just see them as, say, fodder for comparative philology, then something's dead inside of you.
Yeah, pretty much. He also talks about how it's stupid that we've decided that fairy stories are for children, because fairy stories worth reading should be for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And we think they're for children. He has this great line about how it's not because they're particularly like suited for children. It's more like how old furniture gets put in children's playrooms when you don't want it anymore. And that's how fairy stories have ended up as being for children.
Yeah.
Because we don't really care what happens to them anymore, so the children might as well use them.
Yeah. And there's some really interesting he has some really interesting things to say about children as such in there as well.
Yeah. I kind of love what he has to say, because he talks about how we shouldn't. He gripes with Andrew Lang about this, about how children aren't this like perfect innocent creature that gets spoiled as they grow up. Children are just smaller humans with less life experience.
Well, the great thing is that he says, and I think I actually wrote this down. He says something to the effect of, these views become more prevalent with less. I think this is an error, at best an error of false sentiment, and one that is therefore most often made by those who, for whatever private reason, such as childlessness, tend to think of children as a special kind of creature, almost a different race, rather than as normal, if immature members of a particular family and of the human family at large. And his pointing out that that connection between misunderstanding children and like childlessness in general,
or just complete lack of exposure to children.
Yeah. Well, because this notion of children as like innocent, pure creatures is like I don't know how you can have children for a year without realizing, like, oh, yeah, they're people. And I mean, like, Augustine gets, St. Augustine gets lambasted all the time for, there's a hilarious story behind, this is a total aside, but eggcorns are when people take idiomatic phrases or words and turn them into another one. So like, it's a dog eat dog world. Some people say it's a doggy dog world, or like the phrase is actually nip it in the bud, but then people turn it into nip it in the butt. So those are called eggcorns. And there's like
Oh, or kitten
there's
caboodle.
yes, kitten caboodle, exactly. So there's an eggcorn in our family, which is, instead of lambasting, it's lamb blasting. So like shooting a baby sheep at anyway. So I almost just lost my train of thought there.
Augustine, the
Augustine gets
sinfulness of children.
lambasted all the time for the way he talks about the sinfulness and selfishness of infants at like suckling early on in Confessions. But yeah, I mean, there may not be a consciousness there, but like, dang, in it, let's say treating people well is something that only very few people approach naturally. Almost everyone else, it has to be like, you got to work it into them.
Well, and even if it's like fuzzy when it comes to babies, because, and I was actually, Jordan Peterson was just talking about this on the Bill Maher show, which was really interesting, about how up through 6 months, like basically everything a baby says or asks for is right, and like it's just what they need. But somewhere between 6 and 9 months, it depends on the child, they start learning how to like manipulate and be selfish in there. And so at around 9 months, they start, according to Peterson, they start being able to understand discipline, and also they start needing some like, no, I'm not giving into every single thing you say.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, it really is interesting. Yeah, I don't know exactly about there, but there's totally a shift that we've seen in our children where even where you, like, let's say, have to make them do the things that they need to do. Like, our children tend to get very distracted during eating because they're just really excited to know
There's
what's
so
going
much
on.
going on.
There's so much going on. It's like, no, you actually have to eat, because if you don't, you'll be miserable. Or like sleeping, where they're like, I just want to hang out. And no, you need to go to sleep,
No.
because if you don't, you're going to be miserable and everyone else is going to be miserable.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so there's why, yeah, the middle section on that whole thing on children, and why have we relegated fairy stories to children? Should that be the case? Why it's not the case?
Yeah, and then he talks a little bit more about philology. He talks some about his own like history with fairy stories, which is fun, and how he actually wasn't super into them as a child. But as he got older, he actually started to like them better. And then he sort of transitions, and he realized that he's not just talking about fairy stories. He's talking about this sort of like rising genre of fantasy that that hadn't really been named yet, because Lord of the Rings was kind of the first big one.
Yeah, which is really interesting. Okay, so I've got a couple things there, and then and then he has a fantastic 2-page epilogue, which is just completely worthy of reading.
Yes.
So this connection between fantasy and fairy story is really interesting, because, well, for one thing, as you said, the notion of fantasy as a genre, my understanding is like Tolkien's basically responsible for giving birth to it with the Lord of the Rings, and he sees the Lord of the Rings as a fairy story. Like, if you read on fairy story, you'll realize everything that he says a good fairy story is supposed to do, he very, very intentionally did with the Lord of the Rings, and maybe even more so with the Silmarillion. And there's lots of little interesting comments about the connection between myth and language in this essay.
Yeah.
That are also, he apparently at one point joked that he wrote this Lord of the Rings in order that he could say, the stars shine on the hour of our meeting in Elvish. So, which is really interesting because I think a lot of what you see now is there's this thing of I want to tell a story, so then people do work, quote unquote world building for fantasy writers, and then and then they go into like the detail of that, like say languages or things like that, and you might see that in
Hmm.
some really involved fantasy world. I haven't read any of is it George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones? I haven't read any of
Yeah,
that.
I
I
haven't
know,
read those
or
either.
Brandon Sanderson. I
I
haven't read
think
any.
Brandon Sanderson does some of
So
that.
Tolkien actually did the opposite by his own admission, which was he wanted
Hmm.
Elvish to make Elvish, but he understood that if you're going to create a language, it has to have a mythology, and if you're going to have a mythology, you have to come to that mythology through, say, a story. And so the way we think
Right.
about it is like this, the Lord of the Rings, and then for the the nerds, there's the Silmarillion, and then for the uber nerds, there's the various Elvish languages. And in Tolkien's mind, it was actually the other way around. He wrote the Lord of the Rings so he could write the Silmarillion, and Silmarillion so he could have Elvish. Um,
Right.
but but the fact that he sees the Lord of the Rings as coming out of fairy stories and then fantasy, what we've all inherited as fantasy out of that, is interesting to me because and there's several other points in here that support this. I've been mulling on the notion that science fiction is actually a kind of fairy tale.
Yeah.
This
Well,
science fiction is modern fairy story.
the distinction between science fiction and fantasy, I think, is often just an aesthetic one. I think they're usually trying to do the same sort of thing.
Yes. Well,
Um,
keep
just
going.
through
Yeah.
like different avenues, and they look different, which is why it does kind of make sense that bookstores always just lump them together.
Yeah. Well, I think probably with bookstores, it's this notion of, well, it's not real. I mean, that's probably the distinction that's being,
Yeah.
it's not, whereas say fiction is seen as
Realistic fiction.
realistic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I think that the distinction between probably fantasy and science fiction is something like science fiction to some degree uses the laws of science to create that internal consistency of the secondary world that Tolkien talks about as
Hmm.
being necessary to good fantasy, whereas fantasy uses some other kind of internal consistency. And to me, that distinction is very secondary to what's going on there. And then maybe the other difference would be something like we're so like poisoned and obsessed by like truth in that sense that we feel more legitimate in reading science fiction because it's it's real, like because we believe in
It
science,
could
and
be
so like
real. Yeah.
yeah, and so it could be real. But I think the fairy stories, at least many of them that Tolkien's bringing up, as told in say times where the edges of the map were fuzzier, were functioning in exactly the same way as science fiction. It's, oh well, we don't have other sentient beings that we can speak to on Earth, but hey, if you go far enough away to the places that we've never been, then
Yeah.
you've got what is it,
True.
Pandora and James Cameron's Avatar. To me, James Cameron's Avatar is actually is a is a really clear example of a fairy tale. Like that's a fairy tale.
Mm.
And I think there's a reason that the story, people look at the story as being extraordinarily unoriginal. And it's like, yeah, sure. But why was it the highest grossing film of all time when it came out? It's like
Twice.
twice. I haven't even seen the second one. But it's like, but it's because I think for all of the reason that fairy tales are appealing to us, but then it has this veneer of scientism to it that
Hmm.
let everyone let their guard down and be like, oh yeah, this is like, they did a really good job with like the scientific realism of it, and I can totally believe that I'm there. And so we're able to get into the story without having to say mock it, which Tolkien makes a huge point over and over about the absolute poison and to think when
Yeah.
you think about like the way fairy tales are told now is sort of like the sniggering of the adults over the heads of the children. Like, boy, that really struck me as why this sort of cynicism of storytelling now. I mean, it's everywhere. Like it's so prevalent. It's like you can't tell a story without laughing at the story. That is, I mean,
Right.
that's sort of the
That's the
what.
meta modern thing that
Mhm.
Vanderklay's been talking about, right?
Yes, I think so. I except that I think the meta modern is this sort of, well, we can't take the story seriously, but dang it, we want to, so we're going to pretend that we do, or something like that. I
Oh
watched,
yeah, I guess it's the postmodern thing, then meta modern adds another layer onto it.
yes, that says, yeah, we're all grown ups and we understand that postmodernism what's going on, but really we do want to have like, the good side win and the bad side lose, even if we don't believe in them, and even if we don't
Mm-hmm.
believe that there's any objective reality, we're gonna create this sort of like quasi-objective reality that we can inhabit because that's what makes us happy. Thomas Flight's video on meta modern movies, like that's basically what I understood him as saying, is that it's this sort of,
Yeah.
which is interesting because that's kind of the sort of escapism that Tolkien is talking about in here.
Yeah,
So
it is.
from a sort of a narrative and semantic standpoint. So, well, is
Yeah,
there
he talks a lot about suspension of disbelief, which I kind of want to get back to at some
great?
point.
Yeah. So
Just
what?
need to
Yeah,
find it.
what did you read as Tolkien's discussion on suspension of belief in and its role in, say, reading fairy stories?
He's kind of negative about suspension of disbelief. He thinks it's a bad way to put it because it's not what actually happens.
Yeah.
Um, and he actually he talks a lot about how it's much more suited to drama because drama, like when you're seeing a play enacted, you really do need to suspend your disbelief, but when you're reading a story, you can sort of enter into the story on its own terms without so much. It's not that you're suspending your disbelief because you know it's a story, you recognize it as a story. He calls it a secondary world. You enter
Hmm.
into this secondary world on its own terms, and you know it's not the primary world. But if it's well done enough, you'll sort of start to forget, which isn't really suspending your disbelief so much as just like being so immersed in the story that you don't care.
Yeah, it's it's that interesting thing of, say, um, well, I have a really petty example of it in my own life. I remember watching one of the Avengers movies, and I think that they're supposed to be in upstate New York, and you've got all this kind of like reality manipulation with these magical gemstones and some purple space tyrant coming to destroy half the universe. And I'm tracking with that, and then they've got like bird songs from somewhere in California playing in upstate New York, and as background sound. And I was like, no. And I like, look, I get it. I,
I just did a really petty example of that like this past week too. But
but
do you know the
it's exactly
Librarian
that.
series?
Yeah, what series?
The Librarian movies.
No.
It's kind of like Indiana Jones, but like comedic Indiana Jones. They're pretty fun, but they were doing all these like language things, and I got very annoyed because the language things were just like blatantly wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and you say, okay, well, we're in this crazy fantasy world that has, let's say, on a propositional level, very little correspondence to our own. But then, so why am I bothered by, you know, by this thing? It's like, well, because we're not actually playing fast and loose with reality. We're following the rules. Now, we're somewhere else, and so some of the laws are different. But like,
Mm-hmm.
you still have to follow those rules because we want something that's internally, there's an internal coherence to it. And I think that notion of stories being internally coherent is something that is increasingly clear to me as being just completely essential. And
Mm-hmm.
later on, when he's going to talk about what he considers to be the very core of fairy stories, the eucatastrophe, um, I've been one of the things that I've been chewing on is the difference between a eucatastrophe and what people call really negatively the Deus ex machina, right?
Mm-hmm.
So so, and I think that the whole difference is that a eucatastrophe comes, even though it's unforeseeable. Once you've seen it, you see how it came out of the story. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
intrinsic. Like eucatastrophes are intrinsic. Deus ex machinas are extrinsic. And what's so interesting to me is that that is actually the difference between a phenomenal story and a bad story is. And so I think that's part of why we don't, when we're dealing with secondary worlds, you can't play fast and loose. You have to be, you have to, you have to be, you have to play by the rules, because that's actually what makes it an interesting story, which that is an insight in and of itself I find fascinating. Adventures are not about breaking rules, which I think is why so many stories now are, especially by, say, story making entities like Disney, are garbage, is because they're about breaking the rules. I mean, the notion that you could make a movie in which the hero is named Maleficent is like, that's always going to be a bad story, because you can't have a hero who's named Maleficent, like, because they're named Maleficent. It's you.
Yeah. It's at least going to be a bad fairy tale. I don't know if it's like, it might be a good, different kind of a story. I haven't seen Maleficent.
I haven't either. But I'm gonna lamb-blast it anyway. So
I just, especially when it comes to like fairy tales, people keep thinking like fairy tale just means anything unrealistic or magical, and there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah.
I think I just figured out why the Eagles aren't a Deus Ex Machina, by the way, because some people complain about that, and it's because the eucatastrophe has already been accomplished. They've already won. The Eagles are just making the like boring, annoying, getting back out of Mordor part easy, and like no one wants to read that anyway.
Well, and even more than that, I think there's this, without analyzing like the mechanism of why that would or wouldn't have worked. And I think that Tolkien, actually, I haven't listened to his defense of it, but like, it seems pretty. I think anyone who thinks, oh, you could have just flown in on the Eagles, underestimates the power of Sauron. That's basically what I would say.
Yeah, well, there's definitely that.
But there's this line at the end. There's a line at the end of The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis where what Diggory comes back and he brings that apple from the garden at the end of the world. And we all know what garden it is, so you don't have to say. To his mother, and she eats some of it and she recovers, and then it says, what does he say? He says something like, it seems often in life that when things are getting worse, they continue to get worse. But when things start getting better, often they just keep getting better. And so Diggory's father comes back from India. They inherit all this money, and he goes out and they're able to live out in this beautiful house in the country where he has a pony and all of these things. And that notion of when things, especially at the end of the story for the happy ending, when things get better, they just keep getting better. And so there's a sense in which, having defeated Sauron, like all of these avenues of blessing and goodness are open to them. And so there's no longer the return. I think in it you also see the difference between, say, the passion and crucifixion of our Lord is this pattern of reality compared to his resurrection, right? His resurrection is apparently effortless in comparison to it takes a while for him to get on the cross and die. It doesn't seem to take any time for him to be resurrected. And I mean, even think about that. I mean, that's fascinating, right? So I think that there's all sorts of little like threads in Tolkien that you can see where his imagination, how deeply his imagination is formed by certain stories with a capital S. And even so our Lord after his resurrection, before he's in the flesh, but he's walking around everywhere. I mean, he's bound by the limitations that you and I have. You can get somewhere at 3 miles an hour on foot. But after the resurrection, he's just wherever he wants to be, and he's passing through walls and appearing and disappearing. And there's this sense in which he's, even on a physical level, operating in glory. And so I think you even see that. I mean, because
that's true.
And Sam's journey into Mordor is like typologically is like so obviously, Gethsemane and the crucifixion and the harrowing of hell and being brought back. And it's after that like they're just taken from Mordor into the garden, back into the garden in Ithilien. And it's like, and so I think whether consciously or not, you see that same pattern of, having passed through all of that, now they're in this state of they're somewhere higher. In the case of being saved by the Eagles, literally, right? It's like, So you don't.
Well, and the eagles are semi divine also
Well, yeah,
in
absolutely.
Middle Earth.
They're
So
the messengers of Manwë, and I mean they're in terms of the higher, the hierarchy of being, they're operating at a level that's something much more like angels than men.
yeah.
Which is also probably why they don't do anything else, because salvation is accomplished through men and not through angels. So
Yeah, and if you want to take it down to a practical level, Sauron could probably sense them and one-shot them. So
okay, so you've got, he makes this argument that fairy stories aren't just crazy things. They have to be internally consistent, and he makes this. There's this what do you think of this notion of the author as a sub-creator making a secondary world?
I mean, that's kind of what part of what made me want to talk about this again is
okay.
I mean, I really love it. I don't necessarily have a lot to say about it, but I kind of wanted to get it out there. That and this idea of enchantment, which we've been talking about so much all over the place lately. And the idea that sub-creation requires enchantment and also creates this enchantment that you work on others for their own benefit, basically.
Or not.
Or not.
Yeah.
In the case of fairies, it is not to our benefit.
Well, he's got this line where he says, "Small wonder that spell means both a story told and a formula of power over living men."
True.
And actually, when I was reading that, I sent that over to Mark because of the way that he talks about enchantment. I was like, I think you'd appreciate this. Because there's good enchantments as well as bad enchantments. And this whole notion of what we're doing with secondary worlds is really interesting. Okay, so one of the first things that made me think of was one of my favorite scenes in the Chronicles of Narnia. And listen to me. I this is like my childhood, right? It's like anytime I read Tolkien, I'm talking to C.S. Lewis. And anytime I read C.S. Lewis, I'm talking to Tolkien. It's like it's always back and forth between. But in the Silver Chair, so I think there's 2 or 3 or 4 passages in the entire Chronicles of Narnia that are when you realize what Lewis is. Oh, what is it?
Oh, every time I turn on this light, my camera gets really yellow for a moment.
Oh, so 3 or 4 passages where C.S. Lewis is. I mean, it's part of the story, but the philosophical and theological things that he's saying are just totally remarkable. Another one is Shasta's passage over into Narnia in The Horse and His Boy. But this one in the Silver Chair, when they've destroyed the Silver Chair and Prince Rilian is set free from his enchantment, and the Green Witch shows up, and they're in the Underground Kingdom. And they're like the children and Puddleglum and the prince all tell the Green Witch, the Green Lady, we're gonna leave. We're gonna go back home to Narnia. And she's like, well, where is this Narnia? And so she throws some magical substance in this fire, some infernal incense, and starts playing music. All this stuff, when you start thinking about it, you're like, oh, that's really weird. That's really weird. And she says, okay, describe this world to me. And oh, well, there's the sun there. And what do you mean by the sun? Well, it's like a lamp, but brighter, Oh, you just dreamed about my lamp. You're telling a fantasy about my lamp, Well, there's Aslan. Who's Aslan? Oh, he's like a cat. He's a lion. What's a lion? Oh, it's like a cat, but bigger and more golden and all that. Oh, you just took my idea of a cat. And so there's all sorts of things in terms of what do stories mean? What does metaphor mean? What is the relationship between nature and supernature, between let's say the spiritual and the material, symbol. I mean, it's really interesting. And so the way that it's resolved, which we should all take hint of this, is Puddleglum sticks his nasty old duck foot in the fire, and there's it's like this, which where did this come? This came up somewhere recently, but Lewis in the Screwtape Letters says that the best thing for someone who thinks that they've been mistreated is a good dose of pain.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And he says there's something like nothing like, the pain cleared Puddleglum's head of the enchantment. It's like, yeah,
And then
boy.
he says that most of the fire was gone, and the part that remained smelled like burnt marsh wiggle, which is not at all an enchanting scent.
Yeah, when you read that, you're like, dang, this whole thing is just working on 3 or 4 levels. And then Puddleglum turns to the witch and he says, look, we may just be dreaming, but if a couple of children and a marshwiggle can come up with a world that beats the snot out of your real world here in the underground kingdom, we're going to go out in the dark and spend the rest of our lives looking for this world, instead of spending it here. And I think that's a lot of what Tolkien's talking about in terms of the role of fantasy here, which is that we, especially in the modern world, and I think he makes the argument that this may not have been true. He doesn't know if this was true in the past and doesn't even think that it was. But what fantasy does now is it, for a world that's convinced that the underground kingdom is real, because that's what materialism is. Materialism looks at the underground world where you can't see the heavens. That's what makes the underground world the underground world. And the only light in the underground kingdom is the light that we've made. Like, okay.
Right.
I get it, Lois. I get it. It's like, well, what does fantasy do? It's like, well, you may not initially be able to distinguish between religion and fantasy, but the right thing to do is to get out there after it and not say, look for dragons, because dragons aren't the point. The point is, what are you going to do with the fact that creatures can tell stories that are more compelling than what the material universe without the human mind seems to be able to. This is my okay
reality.
Okay, so then Emma, what this makes me think of immediately is something that Chesterton says. I'm listening to someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, where if you're familiar with orthodoxy, he talks about. It's funny because the stuff Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about now was going on when Chesterton was talking over 100 years ago.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is not original.
Well, no, he's not, but he's really important. Like, I don't like listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson that much, but I think he's really important as a person currently. Where he's, this notion that we're to be cowed by the mere size of things, and that you listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson now, and it's like we didn't even know that there were other galaxies until the Hubble Space Telescope went up, right? We actually can't really grasp how much our physical view of cosmology has changed in the last 200 years. It's actually really, really worthwhile to go back and learn some of the history of that. So the Hubble, this is just a little digression. The Hubble Space Telescope is named after an astronomer named Edwin Hubble, who in the teens or 20s, I think, somewhere in the first 30 years of the 20th century, used sort of these big telescopes that were being developed, used data from them to look at what's called the phase shift of stars, and realize that the further out you went, the more redshifted stars are, which means that there's almost an inconceivably low probability that anything is true except that the universe is expanding away from us. And we're all super comfortable with the materialist position of the atheist materialist position of the Big Bang and an expanding universe. But previous to Edwin Hubble, the materialist notion was that the universe was eternal and static, right? Because to have a starting point implies a creator or some.
That's right. Well, and that might be why the Big Bang was actually theorized by a Catholic priest.
Yes, right. And so what you had previous to Edwin Hubble was you had this theistic view that said the universe has a beginning and it has directionality. And everyone and the materialist atheist position was universe is eternal and static. And then Hubble comes along and with telescope data completely overturns that in terms of our physical model of the universe. And then now it's like, oh, the Christians, and these people who think that, who can't accept that, the universe is changing. No, that's absolutely been the Christian position. And it's only since Edwin. So it's really interesting that we have that thing happening with Edwin Hubble, and the overturning of the static view of the universe in the scientific materialist realm. And then you get the Hubble Space Telescope that comes along, named after Edwin Hubble, that turns out all those things outside of our galaxies are not stars; they're actually more galaxies, and that we have, let's say, a universe that, well, we really don't know where the physical edge of the universe is, and there's various reasons for that, but there's at least like low end estimate of like 100 billion galaxies in the universe. And so then you have people like Neil deGrasse Tyson who come along. I think he's a doctor. I should probably call him Dr. Tyson. Come along. Dr. Tyson comes along and attempts to inspire people with the size of the universe, which is exactly the thing that Chesterton was arguing against. And what's interesting is that what you find out is you don't actually have people whose lives are informed in a meaningful way by the size of the universe, even though we found out that it's like 100 billion times bigger than we thought it was back when Chesterton was talking. So there's like, if you want a real demonstration that these quantitative changes in our understanding of the universe do not affect our qualitative understanding of it. I mean, you can look at that history in the 20th century and it's into Tyson's work, Dr. Tyson's work, and see, like, it just doesn't produce meaning in people's lives. Like, objectively speaking, you can look at it and you can tell that it.
Well, and it kind of makes sense why, because what does it matter whether the universe is one galaxy or 100 billion galaxies when I can walk like 3 miles?
Yes.
Before I start to get tired.
So there's a line from Wendell Berry's novel Jayber Crow, which is well worth reading. It's got some really interesting stuff in it, but there's this. It's in the series that he wrote about a small town in Kentucky. This, like, I mean, very small town, like 6-building town in Kentucky. And Jayber Crow he follows these various members and families in different novels, and this one's about the barber, he comes back to the town and runs his little barber shop and has a little garden, and goes out drinking moonshine with the boys, and he never gets married, and he has this very like quiet private life, but he ends up buying a car. And when he buys a car, he's able to drive to the big town that you get the impression of like 1,000 people. And there's a scene, I think it's probably one of the main turning points in the story, where he drives to the town, he's out at night, and something happens in the bar that they're hanging out in, and he gets halfway home and he just pulls his car over on the side of the road and leaves it there with the keys in the ignition and walks home. And Barry says that when he left his car there, that, quote, the world was big again, because he couldn't just drive anywhere, right? It took time. And so there's this is, I think, a lot of what, there's this great part where he talks about this movement, these like phases of fantasy through history that he's bringing up from Chesterton, where he says that it remains true nonetheless that we must not in our day be too curious, too anxious to be original, for we are older, certainly older than our known ancestors. The days are gone, as Chesterton said, when red, blue, and yellow could be invented blindingly in a black and white world. Gone also are the days when from blue and yellow green was made, unique as a new color. And he goes on to say that the goal of fantasy is to wake us back up to the things that are around us. Create a fantasy because it is mainly trying to do something else, make something new, may open your hoard. Like, these are all the things, our hoard of like things that we possess in our minds, and let all the locked things fly away like caged birds. The gems all turn into flowers and flames, and you will be warned that all you had or knew was dangerous and potent, not really effectively chained, free and wild, no more yours than they were you. So he says here it is. Fantasy is made out of the primary world, but a good craftsman loves his material and has a knowledge and feeling for clay, stone, and wood, which only the art of making can give. By the forging of Gran, which is a mythical sword, cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and moon, root and stalk, flower and fruit are manifest in glory. For the storymaker who allows himself to be free with nature can be her lover, not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of words and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. And so I think this is where you see the difference between like what Tolkien is trying to get at, and Chesterton, all these and George MacDonald, these fairy story makers, as opposed to someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, where he's not trying to say, and man, this is okay. So this is Dante too, right? Because who says, someone said this about Dante, and I can never remember who it is, that Dante does not elevate our thoughts so much as deepen them, right? So,
oh yeah, you were just talking about this.
Yeah, I think like
was it Elliot?
You were in the conversation when I brought this up, but like it's so relevant.
It might have been Elliot. We at least moved on to talking about Elliot right after that.
It might have been. I mean, Elliot has a quote on the back of my Chiardi translation. Elliot says, "The world is divided between Dante and Shakespeare. There is no third." but I mean, even Emma, listen to even the list he gives there: stone, wood, iron, tree, grass, house, fire, bread, wine. And I have a pretty darn good guess as to why he ends the list with bread and wine. But if you'll notice, those are all, he's using all the Germanic roots. He's not using the Latin roots there for those words.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's not, it's not petrified things. It's not domicile, right? It's not conflagrations. Because in English, you've got the French and the Germanic are the everyday, right? Dig versus excavate, cow versus beef, on and on and on and on. And because I think what he's saying fairy stories are trying to do is to wake us back up to the everyday things that we encounter, which is the opposite of what, say, someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson is trying to do, where he's saying that the real adventure of life is black holes and galaxies, which, by the way, think about the move that Neil deGrasse Tyson is making there. He's saying, if you want to understand, if you want to be, the best things are in the heavens. That's what he's saying. And in that case, I agree with him. I just think he's mistaken about where those heavens are.
He's got the wrong heavens.
Look, I mean, come on, Emma. It's so funny to me when you get these these attempts to sort of create fantasy out of the scientific knowledge, and they tried to inspire us with this notion that, say, we're made by the stuff of the stars. And it's like, you're trying to tell us that creation comes from heaven. It's like, yeah, there's a reason that when you tell science that way, hey, it's kind of compelling, and you can get people to get tattoos on their arms and stuff. But you're not raising science up so much as actually just resurrecting the thing that we've always known was true. Anyway, so this notion that fantasy is the ultimate goal of fantasy is something like to bring us back to where we can see what's actually been in front of us. Oh, here's that other one. He says,
he calls it recovery.
Yes, recovery. So what do you think of that? Like, there's just so much there that I almost don't even know where to start with this notion of recovery.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've been talking about it a lot, maybe under the phrase enchantment, because like everywhere I go around this little corner lately, someone's talking about enchantment.
Yeah.
And I do think this sense of recovery or re-enchantment, I do think this sense of recovery is sort of what they're getting at.
Yeah.
While Tolkien uses enchantment, like we talked about before, to mean sort of weaving that spell that influences people and changes how they see things.
Yeah.
And I think recovery is really what we're looking for right now. And that's what people talk about, like with the meaning crisis, is everything seems so flat. And the best way to deal with that seems to be both opening up this hierarchy of like depth and meaning, and also just rediscovering like how important ordinary things can be. That seems to be the easiest way to, or the best way to deal with it.
Did you hear any of me and Mark's conversation like 2 weeks ago on the open mic night about normalness.
A tiny bit. I didn't really watch that one.
Yeah, this is just really interesting. That came out of Jonathan Bejo talking with Mary Harrington, and she presented this notion that the world has become anti-normal.
Mm-hmm.
And she was talking more in terms of say norms of behavior or say norms of role. And I mean, I think she's really onto something there. But this whole conversation is now making me think, okay, yeah, we actually have to take that even further and say the norms of everyday. What is going to give us life? Because that's really the question. Always, all the time, it's what is going to give us life. And I guess in that sense, I'm sort of an entrenched Thomist, because I think that's a way to say what St. Thomas Aquinas is saying, which is every being seeks their own good, which is another way of saying they're seeking to have life. And one of the questions about where are we going to find life is the where part, not just like what is it, but where are we going to look? And I think what Mary Harrington is getting at, and I think what Tolkien is getting at here with fairy stories, is that we have to look at the normal things. So you go to the fantastic partially so that you can come back to the normal and realize a little bit more what it is. There's your kitty. I mean, this is the reason I think people write poems about cats, because if you forget what a cat is, like a cat's a crazy thing. Like we just have this creature that hangs out in our house. Also, I think Tolkien's notion of one of the core desires of fairy stories deal with is communion with other creatures. I think that's the same impulse behind having cats in our house, and why I really
like general.
And pets in general, yeah. Why I really like his comment that Beatrix Potter's stories are on the edges of fairyland.
Mm-hmm.
Because
he discounts the rest of what he calls beast fables from being really fairy stories. Right. So Beatrix Potter's a little different.
It's a great connection though, because there's a difference between, say, a story where you realize that these animals are just different people, humans. They're humans that have some correspondence to animals versus actually talking to animals, which is what like Lewis is trying to get at with his talking animals in the Chronicles of Narnia. Those are like, they're animals that talk. They're not people that look like animals. Which is a fundamental, it's a fundamental difference, because what that's part of what that's hopefully doing is waking us up to the fact that when we encounter a chicken or a sheep, well, this is what he says. He says, this is Tolkien again, we must hark back to purple and brown, to dragons and centaurs, and so maybe recover camelopards and green, and even, who knows, we may see again yellow, blue, and red, and look upon horses, sheep, and dogs. This recovery fairy stories help us to make. In that sense only, a taste for them may make or keep us childish. So there's this notion of getting back to being able to see things in some way. And he goes on to say that it's something like cleaning. Fairy stories help us clean the windows is one of the things that they do. But right, Emma, because look, this is part of the whole thing that Pajot's been talking about the center and the margin. Because when you talk about what's going on in fairy stories, to think about it that way is like you're going out into the margin, because it's not good for man to live in fairy, right? This is something that's really important.
Right.
You don't live in fairy, you visit fairy. Fairy's great.
And then you have to come home.
And okay, if you want to.
And Lewis is very emphatic about that in Narnia too.
Yes. Have you read Smith of Wootton Major?
I'm not.
Okay. I think that's the one. If you want a fairy story about what Tolkien thinks fairy stories are supposed to do, that's an excellent one. I mean, that's just what it is. It's just about a guy going to fairy sometimes and what happens to him when he comes home. And so there's this notion, because it's not like we have an equal choice between being fed by the ordinary or the extraordinary. Or sorry, by the center or by the margin. I don't want to say ordinary, extraordinary, by the center, by the margin. They're not the same, because if you go out into the margin, it becomes the center. And then you have to go to the margin again. And you end up in places that you don't want to be. And so it's actually a matter of life and death that we figure out how to be fed by the normal. Like, we have to figure out how to be fed by the normal. You can't, I mean, it's so obvious, Emma, because, like, look, you get married and then your spouse, if you don't pay attention, your spouse becomes normal.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't have stable marriages in a society will just fall apart. Like, it just will. And so even on a basic level like that, it's like, you have to figure out how to do the normal thing. It's like, if everyone quit their job every 3 weeks, the world would fall apart.
Oh, you froze. Okay, you're back.
If everyone quit their job every 3 weeks, if everyone felt like they had to move every 3 weeks, it's like, you can't, if you don't embrace the normal on some level, right? If you don't see the extraordinary, the margin as aiding you in your ability to be fed by the ordinary and the normal, like, the world is going to fall apart. Or you're going to embrace the normal and the ordinary and you're going to die inside. That's the other option, right? So either the world falls apart because everyone's pursuing what's extraordinary and marginal, or you die because you don't know how to be fed, to be kept alive by what's at the center of things.
Right. Or you don't know how to, like, visit the margins and then come back and bring with you more appreciation.
Yes.
Well, I was thinking about it too. Like, the first time you brought up, like, we've become anti-normal, because no one ever tells a child, like, you're normal, as if that's a good thing. It's always like, you're special.
Yeah. Which, normal and special, look, okay, but Emma, maybe it's something like the whole goal is to figure out how the normal is special.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
But there's also this mathematical problem with rejecting what's normal, right? Because there's only a certain number of, say, things that you can inhabit or pay attention to. And if your notion is that you have to be outside of the normal and the special, the normal and the ordinary, then everyone ends up running off in different directions, which is away from each other. So you can't come together, and it's that much harder to come together in communion. And then also you immediately enter into a form of competition with other people. And so what I think is really interesting is, like, you look at, say, as a hyper extreme version of this, the influencer space, right, where your whole goal is to steal attention away from other people. And so anyone else in your space is a competitor with you. And then you look at something like the other extreme, which would be something like Amish agricultural communities, where their goal is actually to not differentiate themselves. And what ends up happening is that affords a tremendous degree of cooperation for them. And it's bottom-up cooperation. It's not this sort of top-down attempted cooperation from communism. But there's actually something in the fact that they all are doing more or less the same thing, which is this communal agricultural enterprise, doing normal things like raising food and making furniture, that all of a sudden they can all come together and cooperate because they're not trying to do something that's abnormal.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes they take that, like, really far. Like, many Amish communities don't wear bright colors.
Yeah. And
sorry, hopefully that wasn't like on my microphone.
I would probably hold up, Catholic Christendom as something more like the model, where you have the monks who all look the same, and then you have people dressed brightly for feast days, and because what that's doing is, and Chesterton makes the same point about the difference between the medieval use of color and the modern use of color, which now color doesn't mean anything. even though we've totally psychologized it, there's just color everywhere. People wear all sorts of colors. We put all kinds of colors on signs. There's no, you compare that to like liturgical colors, where all of a sudden, it's actually more possible for me to see green or purple or red. Right. Yesterday I was the Feast of St. Lawrence, and I went to the little local diocesan parish here. And it's like, boy, I saw red on the priest. I saw it. Like, I actually saw red in a way that I sure don't on, say, various buttons on this computer, or there's something about that. I don't want him to have some crazy exotic pattern of colors on his liturgical garments. I just want to see the colors that he's wearing, and I can actually do that more because they mean something, and because sometimes they're there and then they're not, and it's this movement back and forth between ordinary things. I think that, to Mark's notion of needing contrast to see things, right? That contrast, one way to do that is fairy stories, and another way is just the ordinary to embrace the ordinary variation in life, these cyclical variations that we're given over and over, or repeated variation, which is different from
that always makes me think of the seasons.
Yes,
because there's a way in which my favorite season is this one.
Yes.
Like, each time.
Yes.
Like, I do have preferences and favorites, but also, like, you appreciate each season in contrast to the one before it and after it.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't want it to stay your favorite season the whole time.
Because as we are constituted, we're incapable of it being your favorite season all the time. So that, I guess that's one. And I think this notion of like refreshment that Tolkien talks about as a function of fairy stories is similar, where it lets you step out into other time so that you can appreciate your time. Right. For a little while, you're somewhere else so that you can come back and be glad to be home. And I actually remember at some point in my life, I remember thinking, I'm going to try to just appreciate whatever season that I'm in, because I don't want to be looking forward to the next season all the time. And that's something almost like a spiritual discipline, actually. Well, because what you're doing is you're practicing gratitude, and as the Mass should teach us, right? Always and everywhere. It is our duty and our salvation, always and everywhere, to give you thanks. Right? The first words of the preface. It's like, this is the job. This is our job. Like, it is our duty and our salvation, always and everywhere, to give you thanks. And so the degree to which fairy stories allow us to give thanks and to celebrate the ordinary things of life, to see things again. I mean, and this is what's interesting now is you get into the connection between poetry and fairy story, actually, because I think poetry has a very similar role. And Tolkien actually, I didn't notice this until just now. Tolkien actually brings up his connection between coming to love verse and loving fairy story being at the same time.
Oh, yeah. True. He also includes a little bit of a poem he wrote in here.
Yeah.
Which I want to come back to at some point, but we don't have to go there right now.
So, well, but you're talking about loving the different seasons. That immediately makes me think of Pied Beauty by Father Jerome Manley Hopkins, right? Glory be to God for dappled things. This bright, what is it? Soft, smooth, dim, a dazzle. I can't. It's not one I've got memorized. It's a good one. But this notion that God has given us, God in his unchanging beauty has given us changing beauty that we might come to appreciate it. He who fathers forth beauty, who is past change, praise him. It also reminds me of another one of my favorite poems, which is Richard Wilbur's Lying, which is an extraordinarily good poem. And about half of it is just this wonderful litany of the extraordinary, of shocking encounters with ordinary things. Actually, if you don't mind, I'll read a little bit of it.
All right. And it's called Lying?
Lying. Like to speak an untruth. It's maybe. Actually, this is a great poem. in connection with this because it's talking about fiction, the difference between fiction and lying. Wow, this is a really good poem. This would be a great poem to put into dialogue with this piece. But I'm just gonna go.
Or with
Oh,
Mythopoeia, if you want to
oh
do
my goodness.
poem.
I
Have you
just
read
want to read
Mythopoeia?
Have I read Mythopoeia?
Yeah.
No, I should though.
Oh, I can send it to you. I took like a really short summer class on Tolkien with a couple of friends.
Okay, yeah, I'd
And
love
it was
that.
one of our reading materials.
Look, Emma. When I read, especially this essay, when I read this, I think Tolkien is dealing with the exact same set of problems and is presenting basically the same set of solutions that Peterson, Peugeot, and Vervaeke are presenting and dealing with and
Yeah, I
presenting
think
now.
so too.
Like, it was so surprising to me. It made me feel like everything that those guys are doing was like my childhood again.
Well,
I was like,
that's why I wanted to
feels
talk
so
about it.
interesting. What's that?
And I think that's why I wanted to talk about it with you when I read it again and sort of bring it into this space. And I think that's why when I started watching all this stuff, like it clicked for me because I think there is a sense in which it was like my childhood. And I talked about that a little bit in my randos conversation about how like the symbolic worldview and the sacramental worldview that I sort of picked up from growing up, like both Catholic and reading Tolkien, are very similar.
Well, because my impression is that the Inklings were trying to do with their Mythopoeia was to deal with the meaning crisis, which has, let's say, since their time, deeply metastasized in our culture. And I think they were dealing with it when it was primarily an issue of the academics and the intelligentsia, and now it's the problem of every man.
But if you look at Lewis, he clearly realized that if it wasn't the problem of every man, it was going to be soon.
No question. And I mean, I think that's generally the pattern that you like. That's just a common pattern. But it's interesting too. I think everyone's interested in Richard Rowland and how deeply influenced by Tolkien and Lewis he is, and there's a really strong connection between Tolkien's project and universal history as well. I think you could make a pretty strong argument that what he was doing with the Silmarillion was an attempt at writing a universal history for the British Isles. And then what Lewis does in That Hideous Strength is to then take that and embed it in modern, how would people engage with that universal history in modern England?
Yeah.
So all that, yeah. And actually, too, this is something else that I don't want to get into today, but is really interesting that I'm rereading. I'm finally reading Poetic Diction by Owen Barfield, and I've read Saving the Appearance numerous times. And there's actually a huge amount of overlap between what Tolkien says on fairy stories and about story, and what Barfield says about the evolution of language.
Yeah, that's part of why. Like, I really wanted to talk about this with you because you're like the person I know who knows the most Barfield. And I was curious because I know Barfield also talks about like enchantment and stuff like that. And I was curious how much connection there was between like Barfield and On Fairy Stories.
Well, okay, so there's two quotes that I pulled from this essay. One, Tolkien says, to ask what is the origin of stories, however qualified, so however you qualify that question of the origin of stories, is to ask what is the origin of language and of the mind. Okay, so we've got that. And then 3 pages later, he says, the incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are in our world coeval. So he's got this notion that, right, so the mind, language, and story, he says, are inextricably intertwined. Like, as reality is, our created reality is constituted, you cannot separate the three of them, which I'm totally on board with. Again, this is one of those things where like the stuff that Peugeot and Peterson are talking about story, it's like, yeah, this is exactly what Tolkien was saying. So there's so the part where it starts to really overlap with Barfield's specific theory of the evolution of language is when he starts talking about where stories come from. And so there's a passage in here, if you remember the passage where he's talking about the Norse pantheon, and
Yeah.
so there's the notion that there's this act of personification of the natural order, like natural phenomena like thunder, and then someone says, well, that's probably this man with a red beard and a temper and a hammer and
right. It's sort of drawing that connection. He talks about it as drawing the connection between like the thunder and like the angry farmer down the road, and how there's something essentially the same, like shared between those two.
Right. So so the quote I have is, it is more reasonable to suppose that the farmer popped up in the very moment when thunder, capital T thunder, got a voice and face, that there was a distant growl of thunder in the hills every time a storyteller heard a farmer in a rage. And so that is what Barfield presents as how language used to function and consciousness used to function. So he's mostly dealing with consciousness in Saving the Appearances and language in Poetic Diction. But in both cases, he's pointing to a time in which it wasn't as though people were speaking metaphorically or, let's say, making imaginative connections, but that their perception and their language actually connected the two things. So he brings up in Saving the Appearances this, and I don't know if this is an actual example or a hypothetical one, but Aborigines seeing a connection between like a black cockatoo and a certain palm tree and something else, and a white cockatoo and the sun. And he's like, it's not a poetic action on their part to see more connection, a deeper connection between the white cockatoo and the sun than between the white cockatoo and the black cockatoo, which are parrots, if anyone's wondering. That and Tolkien is making the same argument that we don't have some sort of creative act on the part of a storyteller to associate Thor and thunder, but that like it is a single act of perception on their part, and that it's only later that people come along and disentangle them. And that's actually related to, I think, Barfield's notion of the movement from what he calls original participation to modern idolatry. And the conscious act of storytelling, taking these things, these elements, and putting them together is something much more like Barfield's notion of final participation, in which the imagination is not only actively but consciously involved. And even Tolkien's use of the word imagination, his discussion on the word imagination and on fairy stories is much like Barfield's notion of figuration in Saving the Appearances. So yeah, there's a whole lot there. Tolkien doesn't go into a lot of detail, but if you've read much of Barfield, which I haven't read that much of Barfield, but I've read enough to passing through here, like, oh, wow, there's some Barfield in there. And I don't know if Tolkien was doing that consciously or unconsciously. Based on what I know of the two of them, I would have guessed that they probably argued more than anyone else in the Inklings over things for various reasons. But, you know, even when you argue, clearly there's influence going on there. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of connection between, I think you could add a lot of his discussion on the origin of fairy stories and their evolution as sort of a parallel to, well, I mean, there you've got Tolkien's three, right? Mind, language, and story. Those are the three that he says are inextricably interlinked. And Barfield, on Saving the Appearances, covers mind to some degree. On Poetic Diction is talking about language, and Tolkien here on fairy stories is talking about stories. And so, you know, if their theories are correct, then you should see you should see a similar movement in story, consciousness, and language. So, yeah, there's apparently there are people who know more about Barfield than I do by a long shot, though. So just take that.
Yeah, but I don't know.
Anyway,
you're just the first person I've come across who's really read Barfield.
Goodness, Barfield, he's interesting. I like Barfield more than I used to. I'll say that. And I think weirdly he feels less controversial to me now than he did. Um, I mean, there's still some ways in which he goes really sideways, but I think his analysis of how we think and the way that language functions is really is there's a lot of validity to it. So I wanted to ask you then, what do you think about? Do you think that Peterson is approaching the Bible like it's a fairy story?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there are a lot of ways in which you could say that. I don't know if he's doing it like consciously or anything. I don't know how much Tolkien Peterson has read.
Well, I don't think, certainly not consciously. I guess, okay, let me reframe the question. Okay, do you think, because I don't think he's telling it as a fairy story, because he's approaching it he's using a particular frame that is definitely not the fairy story approach to reality. He's not approaching it like
fantasy.
But I guess, is he doing what Tolkien calls recovery with scripture? Is that the Holy Scriptures? Is that what was so enchanting about what he had to say?
I think it might be. I think that's a really good point to sort of pull out.
So we can see some parallel in between what Tolkien sees fairy stories as being supposed to do with.
He almost does it the other way, though.
Okay.
Like he's re-enchanting the Bible stories.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So I think what Tolkien says fairy stories are supposed to do for ordinary life, I think Peterson is trying to do for scripture, where scripture takes.
And he's using psychology to do it for scripture. So psychology is almost what a weird fairy story.
That's a weird twist.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, there's somewhere at some point I heard Pajot talking about Peterson, and he said he compared Peterson's work to that moment at the end of the Inferno, which I love this so much, where he says that, Dante has been going down and down and down into hell, and he gets to Satan, and you're like, you're at the bottom of everything, and like it couldn't get worse, and then he's like, get on Satan's hairy thigh and start climbing down.
Time to start climbing.
And he climbs down, and it's like at that moment the whole world flips upside down.
Mm-hmm. And he starts climbing up.
Purgatory, and he's climbing back up. And Pajot compares Peterson's project of taking Darwinian evolution, which you would think would be the most, say, furthest from God in some sense, and the furthest from the possibility of value.
Which many people definitely think/thought it was.
Right. And then all of a sudden, when you climb all the way down the pit, what happens is we're back in this world of traditional value that actually Darwinianism is, if you're being honest, should be one of the strongest supports for traditional value and belief. And it's like, what a weird switch. What a weird switch. It's like, it's so strange. And then when you say, okay, because it's kind of it's kind of this notion of the eucatastrophe. It's this thing where you think you catch your breath because of course, and yet I never could have seen it coming. And DC Schindler, in his conversation on, I think it was on the Meaning Code with was it on the Meaning? I think it was his conversation on the Meaning Code on beauty. Have you listened to that? I didn't realize
he'd been on the Meaning Code. No.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. But he brings up.
I've been trying to work through the backlog of climbing Mount Sophia Schindler videos.
I can't remember if it might have been on one of those, but he brings up von Balthasar's notion of drama as the simultaneity of resolution and surprise. And to me, there's a huge amount of congruence between that and the eucatastrophe. This that you couldn't see it coming, but it still it still resolves all of your needs, and it doesn't feel fake. There's this. Man, Emma, I've been on this idea for a really long time and I cannot get off of it. This notion, well, it's the eucatastrophe. It is. And I'm at the point now where I think that the notion of the eucatastrophe may have been one of Tolkien's most important contributions to the world.
I think.
And I think that we're all
Yeah.
I think we're all the poorer for not having a much better understanding of what he was talking about there. Because it's this notion that there's something that could happen. Well, I feel like we should just do you care if I just read that like 2 paragraphs on the eucatastrophe?
No, go for it.
It's just so good.
It is really good, and it deserves to be read over and over again.
But the consolation of fairy stories has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost, I would venture to assert that all complete fairy tales must have it. At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function. But the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale, its or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, the universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. It is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art and having a peculiar quality. Even modern fairy stories can produce this effect sometimes. It is not an easy thing to do. It depends on the whole story, which is the setting of the turn, and yet it reflects a glory backwards. A tale that in any measure succeeds in this point has not wholly failed, whatever flaws it may possess, and whatever mixture or confusion of purpose. It happens even in Andrew Lang's own fairy story, Prince Prigio, unsatisfactory in many ways as it is, when, quote, each knight came alive and lifted his sword and shouted, "Long live Prince Prigio." The joy has a little of that strange, mythical, fairy-like quality, fairy story quality, greater than the event described. It would have none in Lang's tale if the event described were not a piece of a more serious fairy story fantasy than the main bulk of the story, which is in general more frivolous, having the half-mocking smile of the courtly, sophisticated conte. Far more powerful and poignant is the effect in a serious tale of fairy. In such story, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire that for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through.
And I think, yeah. What's hard about the eucatastrophe is like it seems so like obviously true to me, but I also don't know how to explain it without a Christian frame. Like I don't know how to argue that eucatastrophe is true without a Christian frame. And I think that's why it ends up sort of like boxed off in a little corner. Because obviously Tolkien is not concerned about explaining it without a Christian frame because he is deeply Christian, and that's like a big part of his work and a big part of his understanding.
Well, so do you mean the eucatastrophe is true in the primary world, not just in the secondary world of stories?
Maybe, I guess, it
I mean,
being
I would say in the
self-evidently good and not just like escapist in the bad sense in the secondary world. Because if the primary world has no eucatastrophe and we're constantly like coming back to this eucatastrophe in story, aren't we just deceiving ourselves?
well, there's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah.
The first one is, I would say that I would agree that many times the eucatastrophe is hidden. But the problem with the eucatastrophe, and this is the problem with the eucatastrophe, is you have to be obedient to see it. And so if you disbelieve in the eucatastrophe, you'll almost never see it. You might be caught up in someone else's, but there's this notion of, I think this is partially why, and Tolkien says, what does he say? This is another great quote in here. He says, the necessity of keeping promises, even those with intolerable consequences, that together with observing prohibitions runs through all fairyland. This is one of the notes of the Horns of Elfland and not a dim note. So there's this connection between obedience and keeping of promises. Obedience, namely keeping of promises and obeying prohibitions in fairy stories, that is deeply, deeply connected with the eucatastrophe. And so
Right.
my thinking on this right now is something like this, that the reason that one of the main reasons that we read fairy stories is so that we can believe that the eucatastrophes do exist, so that we can keep unkeepable promises and obey unbearable prohibitions. Because if you can't believe that it will turn out all right somehow when you can't see it, not when you're too stupid or because whatever reason, but because you just can't see it. You intrinsically can't see it from this side. Like there's an event horizon that you can't see through. When
Right.
there has to be something that lets you obey. Otherwise, it'll all fall apart. There'll be discatastrophe. That's what Tolkien is saying. And sometimes discatastrophe just comes upon you. But this is the whole conversation between Ivan and Alyosha and the brothers Karamazov, in which the quote, "Beauty will save the world," that's Ivan. That's not Alyosha that says that. It's Ivan. And Ivan says, look, I hear you that something so precious and so wonderful will happen that will make everything before worth it. I refuse. And so what Ivan is saying is, I believe that eucatastrophes exist and yet I refuse. I don't think that there's anything, I don't accept it. And so there's a moral element to this as well, in which and Ivan's catastrophe comes because he won't believe. I don't think that that's a wrong reading of what's going on there. It's his inability to believe that redemption is a good that causes him to fall to pieces. He doesn't cohere. He falls to pieces. I mean, because in some sense, the eucatastrophe is the notion that in the end, everything will fit together. That all of it will fit together. And I think this is why it can't be a Deus Ex Machina, because Deus Ex Machinas don't fit. They're not part of it. But a true eucatastrophe is part of it. And so that's why he has that little line that I read in there where it shines, it comes out of the setting. He says it depends on the whole story, which is the setting of the turn, that is the eucatastrophe, and yet it reflects a glory backwards. And so this is where you get, the early church fathers saying that the whole Old Testament bears Christ, and that they read Christ in every line of the Old Testament. And it's like, you could not have seen that ahead of time, but it shines a glory backwards. And then you see it way back there all over the place because it was lying hidden there. And so then the question is, so your question was, how do you believe, how do you get other people to believe that the eucatastrophe is real? And I would say you can't get someone to believe that, but if they have to read good stories. Like, this is why we read good stories. Because if you read bad stories over and over and over, you'll end up bent. You'll be bent out of shape. And like, this is what Job is about, I think. Like, this is a way of talking about what Job is about. That Job just refuses to accept that there's not going to be the turn. Like, he's waiting for the turn the whole time. He just does not give up on the turn. Now, he despairs in the middle of it and all sorts of things, but like,
he still doesn't give up.
He doesn't kill himself.
You can always bring it back to Job.
Yes, well, Job and the eucatastrophe, because like, this is where we live, Emma. Like, you don't have to fight when it's good, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like that part at the end of in the last battle where Jill is talking with Jewel the unicorn, and she says, "It's too bad that Narnia is always in danger." And Jewel says, "No, of course not. It's just that you show up, you people from your world show up only when there's great trouble," and goes on to, on this long history of Narnia about how, just peaceful king after peaceful king lives their life and rules Narnia. And there's no stories about that. There's no stories about that because you don't need, the moment is sufficient unto itself when things are rightly ordered. And so stories live in this place of things not being ordered. They're waiting for peace. Stories are something like what we tell ourselves in the gap. Something like that. Or the stories that we tell ourselves now. I don't want to say that that's all stories, but like the stories that we tell ourselves now. And so that's why it keeps coming back to Job and the eucatastrophe, is because that's what Revelation is about. It's about the endurance of the saints. And how do you endure? Well, it's exactly that. You have to somehow get to the place where you believe that in the end, that turn will come. In the end or in the middle. At some point, the turn will come. And you have to hold on to those promises that you can't imagine how they could be fulfilled. And like, those are the stories that we love. Like, that's what the Lord of the Rings is too. Right? That's what Sam says to Frodo. He says, I see now that the stories that we tell are the ones where they just kept on going. And the ones where people gave up and turned aside, we don't tell those stories. We tell the stories of the people who keep on going, and those are the ones that, like, deep down inside, we find so compelling. And it's there's this modern diabolical project that tells these stories of people enduring, and then just getting crushed into the dirt, and that's it. I mean, if you want an example of that, 1984 that's what 1984 is. That is. I felt physically sick after reading that story. Like,
yeah, we read that one in high school, and it was oof.
Yeah, and so it's not that there's not a value for those. There's not value for those stories because, as caution, like there's, it's worth remembering what happens when you don't hold on. But the fairy stories are, I think, what Tolkien is saying, and I would agree with him, at their very core is the thing that says, it's okay if you can't see it, but you still have to hold on. And look, few people's lives are so tragic that they never see this happen, like on some degree at some point. And so then you tell those stories to people and to yourself, and like the whole celebration of the church over and over, like every martyr is a eucatastrophe. Right? Thinking about St. Lawrence, like every man and woman that passes through fire and evisceration and torture and holds to their baptismal promises, that's a eucatastrophe. And so we all get together and we celebrate it. And the priest dressed up like he's on fire or covered in blood. And then we remember how good that is. And then we tell those stories to ourselves, to each other, over and over and over, so that we remember, so that I don't know what it is, Emma. I don't have a word for it yet. It's something like patience, and it's something like faith. It's like steadfastness. It's like hopeful steadfastness.
Mhm.
Maybe it's humility. I don't know. Maybe it's just humility. Maybe it's the humility that says that you don't know. Well, it requires that. It requires the humility of saying, I don't know.
It might just be all those things mixed together.
Yeah, it might just be being good.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, do you have anything did you wanted to wrap up with?
Um, I don't think so. Here, let me
And
check
if this is something that you wanted
a
to
little notes
come back around
page.
to at some point, I wouldn't say no to that.
Well, actually, there's another book I want to talk about with you at some point. Have you
Okay.
read Piranesi?
No.
You should read it. It's very good. It's Susanna Clark, and she's like openly trying to sort of follow in the Inkling's footsteps.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's a
Susanna Clark.
fascinating book. It's a really quick read.
Okay. Susanna Clark. Yeah, you can just send that over to me, but
Yeah, I'll
yeah,
send you like a link or whatever.
wonderful.
But no, I think we hit most of the stuff I wanted to talk about. This has
Wonderful.
been really great. Thank you.
Good. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for getting me back on this essay. Had a lot of really good stuff to read again and rehearse.
Yeah.
Did you know that
There are things that are just really good to circle back to every few years.
you know that one of St. Augustine's parsings of the word religion is to reread? He's got
I did not, but I get it.
3 or 4 ways that he parses the word religion. There's religio to tie back together, but there's
Mm-hmm.
also relegere to reread,
Relegere, yeah.
and then there's to re-choose, relegere. So
Oh yeah.
it's to rebind, to reread, and to re-choose. And there's interesting. That's
Oh my
actually
gosh.
that's a good thing.
I could
That's a good thing.
go.
That's a good thing to ponder on. What were you saying?
Oh, I could go on that for ages because it's so different from how we do etymologies now.
I know.
And that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And just the almost opposite worldviews involved in the different etymologies or
Yeah.
the different ways of looking at words.
Well,
Fantastic.
I think fundamentally it involves believing that nothing is an accident. And maybe fairy
Yeah,
stories can
that's a
teach
good
us that
point.
too. So, well, Emma, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you.